Hello, and welcome back to Worm From Home, a podcast exploring the environmental history of East London. This is the third and final part of a series of episodes thinking about war and the woods, and how their intertwined histories led to a woodland growing in Bethnal Green. In previous episodes, we looked at the history of woods and woodsmanship in Britain, and the global impacts of armed conflicts on ecologies. If you missed these, you can go back and listen to them before getting into this final chapter. Last time, we traced the history of military disruption of natural environments and the devastation wrought on both human and non-human life by this ecological destruction. The environments in these case studies were primarily rural: Vietnamese forests, the French countryside, woodlands in Britain. And the work toward their recovery has been a rural endeavour too. Now, we're going to focus on urban environments, on how war in cities damages local ecosystems, and how here in East London, woodland and wildlife have formed a part of post-war urban recovery. From October 1940 until May 1941, the German Luftwaffe carried out a concerted air campaign against industrial centres in Britain. The Blitz killed approximately 40,000 people across the country, civilians who lived and worked in manufacturing and freight-heavy urban areas. Damage to cityscapes was massive, with over 1 million houses damaged or destroyed in London alone. Like most children brought up and educated in Britain, I think I was raised with a very rosy view of the Blitz. Lesser devastating, prolonged incidents of aerial warfare with massive civilian casualties are more of a character-building exercise for British people as a whole. Even outside of classroom projects about storybook evacuees, our contemporary cultural memory of the Blitz is highly mythologised. The propagandised notion of the Blitz spirit is still frequently invoked to discipline the population at times of crisis, to remind us of our supposed unique ability as a country to ride out extreme hardship by internal grit alone, without any need for expensive and complicated things like material assistance from the state. This sentimentalising of the Blitz, of course, obscures its violence. Tens of thousands of men, women and children were injured and killed, were made homeless, were deeply traumatised, sometimes for life. And it also obscures its class character. The Blitz was not something that happened to Britain in some general sense. It happened in particular places, like in London, in Manchester, and in Hull, and even within those places, its devastation was not evenly distributed. In London, it was the east and south of the city that were primarily targeted. These were centres of manufacturing and trade, port areas bringing goods to and from the country. Those who lived in these areas were often also those who worked there, and so it was predominantly working-class neighbourhoods that were hit hard by the 8 months of nighttime air raids, far from the residences of the politicians and civil servants making and implementing decisions about the war. In the long-established freight and logistics centre of Docklands, fires burned throughout the night bombings, as incendiary bombs ignited warehouses and nearby buildings. The fires caused a huge amount of damage in and of themselves, but were also meant to guide German bombers towards their targets in the dark. The incendiary bombs first, to guide the way for heavier munitions to hit an otherwise blacked-out city. In ways reminiscent of the American bombing of Vietnam that we discussed in the previous episode, the land was thus twice assaulted, first set ablaze and so remade into a landscape more convenient for the military strategy of those bombing, and then damaged again by that bombing itself. The Blitz in East London set neighbourhoods ablaze from West Ham to Wapping, Rotherhithe, Limehouse, and up to Stepney Green, Whitechapel, and Bethnal Green. Holes were blown in roads that had to be repeatedly filled in, and the damaged gas and water lines under them mended over and again. Streets and neighbourhoods that still exist today were bombed repeatedly: Turin Street, Sugarloaf Walk, Wolvery Street, where, in April 1941, the front walls and sections of roofs were ripped off a row of residential houses by a mine and a school hit by a high-explosive bomb. 1 person was killed and another injured. That same spring, Approach Road, that runs between Bethnal Green and Victoria Park, was struck several times, resulting in many civilian casualties. Bombs dropped blew a crater in the road, demolished homes, and ripped part of the Approach Tavern pub frontage off. The pub is still there today. On one of the first nights of the Blitz, Ida Naish was on her way home to East Ham when the air raids began. She made it from Euston to Aldgate, but from there had to carry on foot. Having miraculously run into her mother in the street, the two women walked east. She wrote the next day. Bow Road Station was no more, and Stepney Green had been heavily bombed. I came up to the bus stop and waited with about 20 other people, but it was hopeless. A few taxis came by, and we tried hailing them, but of course we had no luck. I suppose I'd been standing there about 40 minutes, when providentially my mother walked by right in front of me. She, poor soul, had been turned away from Euston at 8:30, and as the raid was still in progress, had started to walk home. She'd already come all the way on foot when I met her, but despite that, suggested that we should walk on. I think if we'd both been feeling hale and hearty, we wouldn't have gone, but we seemed so numbed that nothing much mattered. The whole of the Thames side, from London Bridge to Woolwich, was a raging inferno. You could have seen to read by the light if you'd felt inclined, and unfortunately for us, we had to go by the East India Docks. Commercial Road was the only route open to the east, because owing to the damage done to Bow Road, traffic was being diverted. And just before we got to Burdett Road, the bombs started falling. The shelters seemed to be absolutely non-existent, so we just went on. At one time, we were made to go around back turnings, because a delayed action bomb had fallen in the main road and nothing could pass. What was so maddening was the persistent drone of enemy planes, which, I might mention, are easily distinguishable from our own. We couldn't get away from it, and felt so completely helpless. As in other parts of London, bomb shelter availability in Bethnal Green was piecemeal, and the government was slow in opening up high-capacity shelter spaces like underground stations. People with large enough back gardens could install galvanised metal Anderson shelters dug into the ground, large enough to protect a family from the falling debris of nearby strikes. Some went under railway arches when the sirens sounded, or had to make do with basements and cellars where they could become trapped by rubble. On Approach Road, 18 people died while sheltering in a cellar under a collapsed building. They were unable to be rescued due to the size of the fire burning above them. Cities had not been built to be resilient against this form of aerial warfare. The urban environment was extensively damaged by the bombings, and the state of war also made that environment itself potentially lethal to its inhabitants. In the single largest loss of life during the London Blitz, 173 people were killed on the steps down to the eastern entrance of Bethnal Green tube station. It was already dark and past 8 p.m. on the 3rd of March 1943 when the first air raid sirens sounded over Bethnal Green. The worst years of the Blitz in the earlier 40s were mostly over, but people made their way once again to the underground station, as yet unfinished and not in use for trains, but outfitted with bunks and amenities for use as a bomb shelter. Several buses dropped passengers off outside, who also joined the queue to get in. Sometime after 8:30, a loud barrage sounded from a new anti-aircraft installation nearby, and a woman holding her infant child fell at the foot of the steps down to the station concourse. Others fell on top of her, and the crowd pushed forward from the street-level entrance, unaware of what was happening beneath them and believing that bombs were closing in. 300 people ended up crushed into the L-shaped stairway space of only 26 steps. If you want to feel exactly how small this space was, the same entrance, with the same number of steps, is still in place at the southeast subway into the station. The crush was so comprehensive that rescue efforts had to be made from below, with rescuers entering the tube tunnels between Mile End and Bethnal Green through manholes. It was over 3 hours, at 11:40 p.m, before the last person was pulled from the station entrance. When war happens in cities, it is not merely a question of military losses or gains, but of catastrophe for regular people, of fundamental disruption to the very material fabric of people's lives. The deaths at Bethnal Green Tube not only constituted the largest single casualty event of the London Blitz, but was the largest civilian loss of life in Britain during the entire Second World War. No bombs fell in Bethnal Green on the night of 3rd of March 1943. The disaster at the tube station was an accident, an accident in which the interaction between people, their rational fear of bombardment, and decisions made for them about safety infrastructure and what they could have access to ended up killing 137 people. One incident in which geographies of government negligence and the lethality of urban landscapes violently disrupted by war came together to cause mass tragedy. An investigation declassified after the end of the war revealed that the council had repeatedly requested additional safety measures for the shelter entranceway from the government and had been repeatedly denied. The entrance was unsafe, especially for large numbers of people trying to enter at once. There was no handrail, no one posted there to give assistance, no white edging on the steps to guide people down in the dark of the blackout. After the catastrophe, these measures were immediately and quietly put in place. A local campaign has had to fight hard to make this information public and to secure funding and permission for a permanent memorial finally erected in 2016. This memorial, named Stairway to Heaven, is a large inverted wooden staircase carved with the name of each man, woman and child lost there. Raised high off the ground over a memorial garden, it looms at what is now one of 3 entrances to the station, forcing us to remember the violent upheaval that an otherwise ordinary and pleasant neighbourhood has endured and that has changed it. It is one of the very few public monuments to the civilian war dead in Britain. After the Blitz, London saw significant repair and redevelopment. In bomb-hit areas like the East End, large areas of rubble, craters and half-destroyed houses of course had to be cleared and made safe. The Blitz had damaged or destroyed hundreds of thousands of buildings, meticulously catalogued in colour-coded damage maps commissioned by London County Council. But London's urban landscape was by no means put back the way it was. The type of large-scale planning and building required after extensive urban warfare was taken as an opportunity to redesign as well as rebuild, to tackle pre-existing problems of housing and infrastructure, and to impose new schemas for how city life should be organised. Even before the war had ended, several sweeping plans had been proposed that sought to alter entire neighbourhoods, road networks, and even the layout and population distribution of London itself. The actual reconstruction, as seen from the ground, however, was in many cases much more piecemeal, split between smaller private enterprises buying up single plots of land, quangos like the Docklands redevelopment, and regional state administration like the Greater London Council. Reconstruction was dislocated in time, too. Cities are not rebuilt overnight, and as bomb sites were gradually cleared and still-standing buildings razed to build social housing, new roads or car parks, much of East London was still peppered with rubble mounds and half-destroyed buildings. Throughout the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, rubble and cleared but undeveloped brownfield sites were still common to see. The cityscape during this period was notably less green than it is today. Photographs from the 1960s and 70s show streets coloured primarily by the muted greys and browns of brick buildings and tarmac roads, with splashes of colour from the bright paint of shop signs and advertisements. Where similar photos in the same neighbourhoods today would show glimpses of parks and smaller green spaces, street planters and trees, in the mid-century, green really is conspicuous by its absence from the cityscape. But despite this lack of deliberate environmental planning, these brownfield sites and undisturbed heaps of debris became havens for city wildlife. As lots lay idle in human terms, awaiting permission, planning and resources for redevelopment, non-human life found places to thrive. Birch copses grew over the rubble mounds of Cable Street, visited by flocks of goldfinches. People picked blackberries from the tangles of brambles growing on abandoned brownfield. Starlings and sparrows nested in huge numbers on Whitechapel High Street. It is the ecological tendency of untended land in Britain to become secondary woodland, to begin to grow with often hardy trees that thrive in otherwise poor soils, and after the Blitz it seems as though this could be observed even in the heart of the city. One such abandoned site was in Bethnal Green, a stone's throw from where the tube disaster had occurred, and where German air raids had destroyed a church, a pub, and a number of houses. One large house had survived and was still in use, but had eventually been pulled down. The site was under the control of the Greater London Council, who, by the 1970s, had decided to use the land as part of a broader effort in environmental and green space policy. The GLC put up a fence and planted some trees, creating the first embryonic incarnation of what was to become the Bethnal Green Nature Reserve. A local urban environmental group called the East End Wildlife Group was eventually approached about running the site by the landscape architects employed on behalf of the GLC, and in the very early 1980s took it over. They, followed by the Tower Hamlets Environment Trust, had just enough funding to keep the reserve open and begin to develop it ecologically. They planted more trees alongside those originally put in by the GLC and what had already been growing on the bomb site. They experimented with what plants would grow well in this new woodland, a trial and error process of planting, seeding, and seeing what conditions would attract or repel different plants to self-seed. They put in a pond, and for several years the reserve heaved with the croaking of frogs and toads. Since its early days, the reserve has been through several incarnations, from a site fenced off by the GLC, to St Jude's Nature Park, to Bethnal Green Nature Reserve. It has been managed and cared for by a patchwork of local groups and residents, and for the last decade or so has been managed by a group called Phytology. Today, the site has a handful of main habitat areas, and the wartime history of the land is still evident in places. One of the earliest projects Phytology undertook was creating a medicine garden, growing native plants traditionally used for food and remedies. Several years of careful horticultural work have restored the soil here, removing post-war contaminants and increasing the level of nutrients present. The soil quality of the medicine garden is much higher than at other parts of the site, and it has tiered beds full of dill, lemon balm, wild strawberries, yarrow, and more. This area is open and sunny with few overhanging trees, and neighbours a cluster of ponds. The reserve has hosted a variety of ponds through its history. At present, there are 2 bucket ponds, round holes sunk into the ground with rich vegetation growing in and out of the water in spring and summer that dries and dies back in the winter. Surrounded by a carpet of the round leaves of winter heliotrope and loomed over by the dry, dun-coloured seed heads of teasels. Bright yellow water marigolds bloom out of the water and irises stand at the edges. Next to these is a larger, shallower pond, more recently restored into a rich habitat for water plants and wildlife. As summer starts, white water lilies open and newts come to the pond to breed. If you sit quietly at the water's edge, as the water forget-me-nots are flowering bright blue, eventually you'll notice bubbles breaking the surface and spot the black bodies of newts diving and floating in their strange, stiff way under the water. Leaving the sunny ponds and medicine garden through a low gate, the atmosphere is suddenly quieter, the light muted, and much more green. You have entered the woodland that comprises the lion's share of the site. At its far edge, a large advertising billboard that has been repurposed to showcase artworks faces the street. Below this grows a small wildflower meadow that blooms in the summer with both planted and self-seeded poppies, cow parsley, grasses, and more. The soil here is periodically sanded to keep it deliberately poor, that is, not at the optimal level of nutrition for most plants that might grow here. The wildflowers, however, love this sandy soil, and altering it in this way discourages other plants that might outcompete the meadow. In other parts, the woodland is bordered by hedges, both living and dead, that run alongside the high metal fence around the site or separate different areas from each other. The living hedges are constructed using traditional methods by volunteer caretakers, from the underwood of suitable trees like hawthorn. To lay a hedge, find a tree that will coppice well and encourage it to grow long, pliable underwood branches. Take and bend a branch, and with a hand axe, hew a chunk of wood out where it bends at the base. Removing this wood should let you bend the branch all the way over, parallel to the ground. Don't worry if you hear the wood snap. As long as there is a strip of bark connecting parts of the branch, it will get all the nutrients it needs and stay alive. Repeat this with several branches and on several coppice stumps, and weave them together horizontally to create a fence-like structure. The trees that make up the hedge will continue to live, even blossom in spring, and become a rich nesting and feeding habitat for insects, birds, and small mammals. Other hedges are dead. A dead hedge is a boundary structure made of discarded plant matter, sticks cut from trees, uprooted unwanted smaller plants, and prunings arranged in an elongated pile. Not dense or wet enough to become a compost heap, the dead hedge can nonetheless be added to as the plant matter that makes it up dries out and decomposes over time. This too becomes an important habitat for animals large and small. At Bethnal Green, one dead hedge has become a new nesting site for a family of foxes that live at the reserve, and the rustling of cubs can be heard in the twigs. These hedges, living and dead, are habitats in and of themselves, but also part of the wider habitat of the woodland. The birds that nest in them also spend time in the woodland, and trees like hawthorn that are woven into the hedges are some of the same species as those that make up the woods. In managed woodlands, including that in Bethnal Green, habitat creation often becomes this collaboration between humans, plants, and other animals. At the more explicit end of this, people create distinct and deliberate habitations for specific animals. The reserve is punctuated by bird and bat boxes, the former often making springtime breeding homes for great tits and blue tits. My favourites are the artificial maternity roosts for bats. The reserve is home to protected pipistrelles, who breed in mated pairs where both parents raise a bat pup together. Growing bat families need a lot of space, and in Bethnal Green they can make use of one of several bat maternity roosts built into the uneven facets of a tall black obelisk that looms out of a small clearing in the woods, with evidence of their use in the white droppings that speckle the dark paint. Bird boxes, dead hedges, all these constructed habitat features require careful maintenance to maintain their suitability for use by a rich variety of animals. The shape or size of a bird box entryway might need changing so that robins are happy or great tits don't dominate blue tits. A nature reserve both preserves nature and produces it. This is not only the case in the city, but there are elements of the urban nature reserve that highlight these tensions. Both the war and the city are woven through the characteristics of the reserve, in some ways really form the substrate in which its ecological relations exist. Because it covers only the area of half a city block, the space is small, and some of the species examples here are few. One juniper tree, one mulberry tree, one family of foxes who make their home here. In some ways, this makes the space more vulnerable to loss in its biodiversity. The consistent care it requires to maintain its state is more concentrated than it might be in a larger woodland or not in the middle of a city. It takes work to create and maintain good woodland soil here. This is partly due to the history of urban warfare that shaped the site. Throughout the woodland, chunks of masonry, now covered with moss growth, are clearly visible through the undergrowth, and there are significant levels of soil contamination from lead and other building materials. Beneath the surface, a great deal of Blitz debris remains. When digging to plant saplings or lay an irrigation line, you might come across a portion of old tiled floor, bricks, or slabs of concrete. This is a boon to the foxes, who have dug a long-standing set inside one of the larger rubble hillocks now covered with vegetation. However, for botanical biodiversity, this rubble is a considerable pressure. To give the woodlands a large enough volume of quality soil to maintain its biodiversity, a combination of traditional and newer woodsmanship methods are used. Mulch piles dot the woodland area of the reserve, where piled up vegetation is left to slowly decompose and create new, richer soil. One form of mulch pile used is the Hügel mound. In this 20th century German permaculture technique, a low enclosure is created by piled logs and sticks. Within this enclosure, first good soil and compost are poured, followed by other vegetation. Over time, this vegetation begins to mulch, adding to the amount of nutritious soil, a process supported by the log enclosure that prevents erosion and preserves moisture within the mound. 2 years ago, a corner of the reserve was given over to mushroom cultivation. In this mycelium alley, logs of different shapes, sizes, and tree species, as well as metal bins filled with straw, have been inoculated with spores from different edible fungi like oyster mushrooms. In this process, millions and millions of spores are introduced into potential growth mediums. For wood impregnation, several deep holes are drilled into a dead log. Then, small wooden furniture dowels are covered in the spores of a mushroom species. The dowel is inserted into the hole, which is then sealed with beeswax or a similar substance. This process mimics the way wood-growing fungi might reproduce in the wild, where spores enter the naturally forming cracks in dead trees. The dead wood is food for the mycelial network, which will eat it as it grows within the body of the log. When this mycelium itself is ready to reproduce, it fruits, with these mushrooms appearing on the surface of the log, ready to release more spores into the world. In the type of mushroom husbandry being done in Mycelium alley, this natural process is mimicked and refined by people. This refinement is not a general improvement. In the wild, mushrooms are doing exactly what they need to do to be mushrooms, but rather a set of tweaks to the process that increase the possibility of the outcomes that we as people want to see. In this case, having particular mushrooms fruiting in specific areas, by inoculating different types of log with certain spores, and then sealing the holes with wax so that spores from other species do not enter. This maximizes the chances of successful mycelial colonization, and ultimately increase the fungal biodiversity of the site as a whole when successfully fruited fungi begin to spore and spread. Mushroom reproduction is a natural process, but in this nature reserve it takes a significant amount of dedicated labour to maintain its presence. Is this natural or not? I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but in thinking about the question, we can learn a lot about what we mean and what we want when we interact with nature. Some of the concerns of reserve caretakers have changed over the decades. Earlier incarnations of the site likely saw more lower growing vegetation that needed lots of sunlight. Now, as the woodlands have grown, shade-loving plants like wild garlic and Alexanders thrive instead. Today, a weekly litter pick or so is often enough to keep rubbish blowing into the site under control, whereas in the 1980s, before street litter bins were as common, rubbish control was a more serious reserve problem. But the deeper concerns of what an urban nature reserve is and what it is for are strikingly similar when listening to those involved in the earliest incarnations of the reserve. One motivation for early caretakers was finding ways to support wildlife as the brownfield sites that had become such rich habitats were gradually redeveloped for much more human-centred use. Urban wildlife groups and sites were rarer in London than they are now, but they were emerging, and those involved often thought of these reserves and community gardens as constituting a network between, for example, Bethnal Green, Cable Street Community Garden, and Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park. It's really compelling to hear these city green spaces from decades ago spoken of in this way, as they still exist, and this sense of a networked, deliberate ecology is so similar to the way I experience them today. An urban nature reserve might feel like a green oasis, totally separate from the city around it, but this isn't strictly true. The microcosm of the nature reserve participates in broader ecological relationships with the living things in the city around it, plant, animal, and human. In the human perspective of land ownership and rights of way, the edges of the reserve might be the fence line and the gates, but of the plants and other animals that live in or around the site, these perimeters are much more porous. Of the 24 or so species of birds that might be recorded at the reserve in a year, only a small number actually make their homes there. Robins and blue tits in the nest boxes, wrens in the undergrowth. But many others are visitors, like pigeons and thrushes who stop by to drink from the pond. Reserve residents like foxes and bats are also not bound within its borders and leave to hunt, play or forage. For plant life too, the edges of the site are fluid. Alongside the woodland shrubs and meadow plants introduced by people, self-seeding plants also blow in by the wind, sown by birds, and blow out from the reserve to nearby green spaces. From this point of view, it makes more sense to think of an urban nature reserve as less a strictly delineated site than as a concentration of resources, a hub of life whose richness of food, nesting possibilities, or breeding sites makes it a centre for a web of life whose distribution includes places outside its fences. One way to consider this is how Bethnal Green's little woodland participates in the broader urban woodland of London. Urban woodland, or urban forest, breaks in its definition from the more traditional sense of woodland that we laid out in episode 1. Urban woodland includes all the trees of the city. those in parks and people's gardens, lining streets and canals, in school playgrounds and community gardens. This forest is defined by the canopy cover it provides in aggregate, by how much of a city area is under the boughs of those trees, even if those trees are not all growing together and creating one ecosystem the way they would do in a more recognisable woodland. So by their nature, urban forests are more diffuse than denser rural woodlands, but they still support life and confer tangible benefits to people in cities. Urban wildlife like foxes, hedgehogs, blue tits and blackbirds make use of these trees for food, habitat, hunting or nesting. Plants like cow parsley that prefer partial shade grow in the covered areas created by city trees and themselves become food and habitat for animals, birds and insects. The presence of trees has more ambient effects on the city too, like removing certain pollutants from the air and supporting mental well-being in the form of access to green space. The presence of trees also has a significant impact on temperature. Cities retain much more heat than non-urban landscapes do. Heat absorption by urban building materials like tarmac and concrete and a tendency to less ventilation than rural areas create an urban heat island effect that raises the temperature in cities compared to their surrounding countryside. During summer heat waves, high city temperatures are unpleasant to most and dangerous to many. The risks to human health and life of extreme heat are increasing as climate change raises temperatures and over half the world's population now lives in cities. It's well known by now that urban forest has a cooling effect, and researchers have worked hard to establish how exactly city trees help to lower temperatures and how their effect can be maximised for city dwellers. Urban trees appear to provide three main cooling mechanisms. First and most obvious, they provide shade. If you are walking down a city street on a hot sunny day, any trees will of course stop as much sun from hitting you, but the tree-lined pavement itself will also have been protected from the sun's rays throughout the course of the day, and so have absorbed less heat that will then radiate off this surface into the surrounding environment. Trees in full foliage are also often of a lighter colour than the surrounding building materials. The dark colours of pavement slabs and road tarmac contribute to greater heat absorption and then subsequent heat radiation. Lighter coloured leaves reflect a large proportion of the sun's rays back and away from the material of the city, in a similar way to light-coloured building materials often used in hot climates. Lastly, as well as preventing the city from absorbing so much heat in the first place, trees actively remove heat through evapotranspiration. We talked a bit about this process in episode 2. Plants take water from the soil for use in photosynthesis, and some of this water is then released into the atmosphere from the stomatal pores in the surface of the leaves. This transpiration process both uses up heat energy and further cools the air with the release of water vapour. Significant research has been undertaken in the UK, including by the Forestry Commission, to find out how the benefits of urban forests can be maximised, which species are hardiest in a city context, are most resilient to drought, and how best to provide these trees with adequate water. This research is motivated by the potential cooling effects of urban forests as an important part of building resilience to climate change. But this and other benefits of city trees are not evenly distributed, and access to city trees forms a sort of urban class geography of climate change exposure. The phrase leafy suburb may be hackneyed press shorthand for affluence, but beyond aesthetics, it does communicate something real about the distribution of urban greenery. The heat mitigation effects of urban forests and other vegetation appear to scale linearly with the size of areas of greenery. Research by Chris Sales and colleagues into urban tree canopy cover across the UK found that canopy cover varies hugely across the country, and that in England, low tree coverage was significantly associated with economic deprivation at the local authority level. While the southeast of England had the highest canopy coverage overall, even within London, a much more granular distinction between more and less economically deprived areas is very clear. Both the ward with the highest coverage in the study, at 80%, and the lowest, at 0%, were within the Greater London area. This systematic association of wealth with canopy coverage likely arises from disparities in how local authorities are financially able to invest in planting and upkeep, and on differences in property prices and gardens. A benchmark of 20% minimum tree coverage is often cited as a goal for towns and cities in the UK, and areas falling beneath this are significantly poorer than those that meet or exceed it. This unequal distribution has real effects. In the UK and across the world, research provides evidence that vulnerability to climate change effects within the city, like extreme heat, is higher in more deprived areas. Even just from a human point of view, green space and urban forest can be as important to people's lives as wholly man-made infrastructure is. The nature reserve at Bethnal Green forms one of these nodes in such a network, a place providing resources for and constituting part of ecologies like the urban forest. Such places, then, are generative, breaking out of their bounds in all sorts of ways and increasing the provision of greenery around them. I think this is true for the more obviously human interactions that take place at the site too. In this episode, we've mentioned artworks and sculptures that are present on the site. Some of these, like the bat maternity roost, have a clear ecological function. Others have a less obvious relationship to the non-human life of the site and fit into this network of relationships in a different way. The billboard by the meadow hosts an ongoing series of works by different artists, one of the most recent being a large painting by Polly Townsend. Townsend made the work upon her return from a residency in the Antarctic, and the mural-sized painting shows the Antarctic landscape with the sea in acrylics and an iceberg in watercolours mixed with the water brought back from the trip to Antarctica. Over the 3 months of the installation at the site, the water-based paint of the iceberg slowly washed away, a clear-cut reminder of the shrinking size of the world's ice caps. It is not the only work at the site that has sought to make explicit the less obvious links between the city and the ecosystems of the world. In the woods sits a large granite boulder, waist-high and painted jet black and peeling. It is one of several commissioned as part of a set of Greenpeace projects to bring boulder barriers on the sea floor to prevent trawler fishing. Trawler fishing requires large, heavy nets to be scraped along the seafloor, catching very large quantities of both fish and any other marine species they happen to pick up. They also cause significant damage to the seabed itself. Both of these effects, overfishing of certain species and the widespread marine ecology destruction that is a side effect of this fishing method, are immensely damaging to fish stocks and marine biodiversity. Greenpeace has taken direct action against this form of fishing several times. Boulders are dropped from ships, and once sunk to the seabed, they're harmless to the local marine life, but cause real problems for the nets that scrape the sea floor for fish, effectively preventing this type of fishing in that area. The boulder in residence at Bethnal Green is called Clang. It has never been on the seabed, but rather was dropped by artist and activist Fiona Banner in protest outside DEFRA, and has the coordinates of the DEFRA offices carved into its base. Clang forms part of a series called Full Stop, with its 2 sister rocks, Peanuts and Orator, that are now on the seabed at Dogger Bank. Each is named for a font, and the linguistic theme of this and the project's naming expresses Banner's criticism of the disjunction between the language of treaties and climate discourse and the reality on the ground of climate change and ecological destruction, an intervention, as the artist puts it, into a crisis in language. The presence of permanent and rotating artworks enriches the site. It's another strand connecting it to the world outside its fences, and also an unashamed reminder that the reserve takes the shape that it does because of consistent human work, that a nature reserve is an act of creation, not just a passive preservation of what exists. It is not just a place to experience art, but also to make art. The very synthetic human processes of art making do not intrude on the nature at the site, but rather a part of what the reserve is as a whole. Art events, storytelling sessions, and creative workshops are periodically held on the site and bring new visitors, a consistent reminder that this is also a human place for human things, and perhaps that careful attention to non-human life also nurtures human experiences of creativity. When I asked other volunteer caretakers at the site about their experiences and about what the reserve means to them, this sense of a place that provides resources beyond materials like water and habitat recurred. that in its capacity as a break from the patterns, sounds, and motions of the city, the nature reserve offers a type of intangible nurture. The reserve is experienced by many as being apart from the city. For myself, I experience this mostly as a perceptible difference in sound. When inside the reserve, it isn't that I can't hear cars on the surrounding roads or people talking on the pavement, but that these noises feel both dampened and somehow less relevant among the undergrowth and the trees. The very quality of the air and the way it mediates sound is different, softer even, when standing in a woodland that is only about as wide as 1 or 2 houses. But this break with the surroundings is not entirely characterized by absence. The reserve is in some ways more an oasis in a true sense, a place where certain resources, certain nourishment, can be found that are otherwise scarce in the wider landscape. The quiet that volunteers speak of, or the ability to breathe, come not merely from the absence of urban sounds or materials, but from the concentrated presence of plants and other life. The sense of respite from the city that the reserve offers is co-created between the site and the people who visit and care for it. One person told me about the importance of connecting with the trees and wanting to nurture the space. Another refers to the reserve as a teacher from which to learn about plants and animals. The human relationships to the reserve are reciprocal. It is not a place from which we only take, nor is it something we only give to. Despite the peace that many find in urban green spaces, it's motion through short and long cycles of change that really define them, and the continuous evolution that takes place in cities in response to both gradual environmental change, like temperature increases, or violent upheavals, like war. People meet at the reserve and learn from it and each other, and take that new knowledge with them elsewhere. The work they do on site alters it with new plants or new habitat conditions, and other animals too bring new resources and take them away to other places. All of this is constant motion. Personally, I find ecology as metaphor a much overused and abused term at present, but there is something intriguingly connected and perhaps ecological about these relationships of give and take that never fully settle as wholly one or the other. Human input to the reserve generates advantageous output for us, almost whether we like it or not, and that is at least a compelling echo of the ecological relationships that exist within and around the site, the eating and being eaten, plants using water and maintaining the water table, and seeds blowing in and out to bring new life and spread life elsewhere. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Worm from Home. Major resources for this episode were the Urban Heat Research commissioned by Forestry England, the book London Dockland by Fiona Rule, and the Blitz by Juliet Gardner. A lot of information also came from oral and archival histories collected by the Stairway to Heaven Memorial Campaign. Most importantly, this episode would not have been possible without the generous contributions of time, knowledge, thoughts, and experiences of the staff and volunteers at Phytology. Thank you all so much for sharing your data, oral histories, and research with me, speaking about your experiences, and for continuing to create such a beautiful community. A full bibliography of all sources in the War in the Woods series will be available soon for free on Patreon. If you've enjoyed the show and want to support production, you can do so with words by leaving a rating and review on your podcast app, sharing the episode, or telling your friends and family. Or, if you'd like, you can support the show with money by becoming a paid member at patreon.com/wormfromhome. In either case, your support will be really appreciated. I make this show because I love radio and I love nature, but also to create opportunities for myself and others to learn. If you have any questions, feedback, or knowledge you'd like to share, or analyses of your own on the topics that we cover, please do get in touch on the Patreon, at Worm From Home on Twitter, or Worm From Home Pod on Instagram. Until next time.